Welcome to Advocacy Exchange, Navigating Texas Injury Law.
Welcome back to Advocacy Exchange, Navigating Texas Injury Law with Paul Littleton. Paul is the Director of Business Development and Operations at Littleton Law Firm, where he helps guide strategy, client communications, and case management across the firm. I'm Lisa Mosbey, and today we're talking about how multiple insurance policies can come into play in a single injury case and how that can affect how a claim is handled from the beginning. Paul, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's always great to chat with you because you have so much experience and have seen so many of these cases. I think it's a wealth of knowledge that you have to share with our audience. What are some of the situations where more than one insurance policy may apply after an accident?
So, when you're thinking about an accident, you're thinking usually about the person at fault. And Texas is a unique state because it's got what they call dual coverages. And a lot of times this comes from your own personal policies that although you yourself weren't at fault, they will come into play to add to the policy of the person who was at fault. So, for an example, a lot of our clients will have car accidents, and typically the injuries or the cost of the medical exceed what the statutory minimum would be, which in Texas is $30,000 per person, not to exceed $60,000 per accident. And in those cases, typically the client would be left holding the debt because the money wasn't enough to suffice the injuries or medical bills or their compensatory damages in some sense or another. So the underinsured provisions of someone's personal own policy could come into play and pick up what may be lacking in terms of that value. And again, it's dependent upon their policy, what the limits might be, but usually it's going to be a minimum of the 30 at least. But it can even go a little bit further than that because, like, if you're a child and you're living in one household, maybe with your mom, maybe your parents are divorced, then maybe the dad's possible policy may pick up as well. So there's layers to it all, having to do many times with the relationships that people have.
And how do you figure out which insurance policies may actually be involved in a case?
Typically, by talking to our clients and utilizing at first, the police report or other documents that may be involved in reference to people involved in the accident. So, if, for example, if it's more than just our client, is there any contributory negligence on maybe the other driver? Maybe they weren't mostly liable. Maybe they had a small percentage of liability. So that the police report would identify that, and then subsequently the conversations we have with our clients and their families as to who they live with, whether they're young or old, whether they're still living in the household of someone that would claim them as a dependent. Those types of things would come out from those conversations.
And what things surprise people once they realize there may be multiple insurance companies involved?
Well, usually it's kind of a little bit of a panic when there's multiple insurance companies involved because typically it means there's a limits issue, right? So when you have lots of claimants against one policy, there's not a steadfast rule for insurance carriers to divvy out funds. So a lot of times it's first come, first serve. And in those cases, the only way to stop it is actually by lawsuit. So, but in typical, if your attorney's office is doing their job and investigating everything properly, they will also have uncovered your policies that may be offering potential coverage for the accident to help you get a better idea about what the scope of your compensation may be.
And then, Paul, does having more than one policy available always make things easier, or can that sometimes create more problems?
I'm going to say most of the time it's easier, but there can be some complications. You can have policy derailments that, for example, if let's just say in one case we just had recently, our client daughter was away for college, and our client took her off the policy while she was away for college. When she came back for the summer, she was driving mom and dad's car, and there was an accident. She wasn't at fault, but her underinsured provisions would come into play normally, but the insurance company denied, saying that they had taken her off the policy and that she was a resident of that household, just even though the college dorms were temporary housing. So we had to go and we had to fight that, which is a lot of definitions.
How do insurance companies handle situations where responsibility may be split across different policies?
They will look at a lot of the different evidence, witness statements, any dash cam, body camera footage, the testimony of all the parties that are involved, and then they will kind of have to apply common sense as well as, whatever the statute is governing that transportation. But generally speaking, it's usually some admission or lack of admission that kind of gets people in there. So, for example, one of the biggest questions is, did you see the other person coming? And if you say no, then it makes you look like you're an inattentive driver, which is actually a violation in the transportation code. But if you say yes, then they're asking you, why didn't you properly commit to an action that would have avoided the accident? And so then you become liable for faulty evasive action. So it's kind of a give and take. So what you say actually really does matter and kind of crosses into how they're going to attribute their compensation.
And that's why you always tell us, don't say anything, call your lawyer first. I hear it over and over again.
Exactly.
So, what kinds of delays or disagreements can come up once multiple carriers are involved?
They can disagree on the amount that they will pay, the evaluation that they will use in terms of their settlements, because every insurance carrier has their own system, in terms of evaluating what's reasonable and necessary, what they will consider, what they won't, what they find valuable, what they don't. And so those things, so you'll have the same case, and then one insurance carrier will be evaluated maybe at 50,000, the other one 10,000. And as a result of that, you end up having to argue and hassle a lot.
How much does liability play in deciding which insurance company pays first or pays all of it or shares the burden? How much they share the burden?
A big part. That's pretty much the whole thing, because you typically cannot claim anything under your policy if you are at fault. So if there's any shared contributory negligence, so if I have an accident, let's say 90% is the other guy, the insurance company found that I had 10% contributory negligence, my policies typically won't entertain paying because I was somewhat negligent. Usually the definition is I cannot be negligent at all.
And does that apply to getting your vehicle fixed or just in lawsuit cases?
If there is any shared responsibility or insurance companies are picking up different percentages, they are only going to pay that percentage that they are finding themselves responsible for. And any disagreements between them, the insurance carriers themselves on that, usually has to get figured out through an arbitrary process, through arbitration between the carriers.
I think that's really confusing for folks when they're purchasing their insurance policies to really understand what is it that I'm paying for and what am I covered for and how do I know if I have enough uninsured coverage? Can you help us with that?
Yeah, yes, I would agree with you absolutely. Having the most uninsured, underinsured coverages, which, as I mentioned, is a dual coverage, is going to be your best bet all of the time. So I would venture to say, $100,000. The minimum is 30, then they go up to 50, then they go up to 100. I think $100,000 is a fair assessment in terms of protecting yourself going forward. But I think that when people are confused about the coverages and when do they apply, you're always going to have to ask yourself those questions: is what happens when, and then your life scenario. So if I travel a lot, if I have kids, if I am, moving a lot for work, although transportation for work is not exactly something that's covered, all of those things come into play, including if you take rideshare like Uber or Lyft a lot, because Uber and Lyft have recently fought any coverages for first party benefits to their customers. It used to be the fight was for the drivers, their employees, but now it's the customers. So if you get, a $30,000 policy and you're a passenger in a Lyft, you have to make sure that your policy will cover you in those circumstances, because if not, if you don't have those coverages, then you're not going to get that coverage and you'll be out.
That's interesting. That's a new one for me. Can you share an example of a case where finding another insurance policy changed the outcome?
Absolutely. So sometimes people try to get a little bit slick. And so, for example, if at the time of the accident, the police report will write down that they had, whatever insurance company. But they know that they switched insurance carriers the week before, for example, right? But the police officer, he doesn't know that at the time. They give him probably the only deck sheet they have at the time, which is to the old policy. And as a result, it looks like this person didn't have an active policy at the time of the accident, causing our clients to use their insurance or maybe not have any compensation at all. So what we do is we run policy searches on those where the policy is not turning up because those switches, people switch all the time. It's cheaper over here. I'm going to do this over there, especially when economic times are hard. And we'll do those policy searches to see if there's anything claiming under their name or their VIN number for that vehicle. Your insurance carrier too will also do that as well, and their insurance checks are a little bit more robust than what we can do on our side, but they always do those checks as well.
How much do coverage limits affect the way the case gets handled or resolved? Just out of curiosity.
Oh, they affect everything. Because if the insurance company has six figures to defend, I promise you they're going to be looking a lot harder about who's at fault and what the medical is and what needs to be considered versus, let's just say, the statutory minimum, which is 30,000, right? So coverage plays a lot. And the second thing is that if early on the carrier sees that the policy might be overwhelmed by how many people are involved or the medical that we initially submit, sometimes before, just right out of the accident, they will offer the policy limits if it's a minimum, just because it's obviously going to end up that way, and they'll just cut their losses now.
And Paul, here's the final question, maybe. What should someone dealing with an accident right now understand about why figuring out the available insurance coverage matters early on?
Because you don't want to end up in a situation where you're not covered. And there's a myriad of different situations that could exist. Really quick, I'll give you one example that just happened to me personally. I purchased a policy through a name brand insurance company, and I put the vehicles on the policy. However, the insurance agent, unbeknownst to me, listed the policies as endorsed vehicles. They were not listed as insured vehicles. And I never thought any different of it because I just thought that the insured vehicle was the primary car, what I used for driving every day, and the other vehicles were listed as endorsed, meaning they were secondary vehicles. So similar to what the primary insured being the husband, for example, in a family, and then the wife and kids are also on the policy, but as secondary. So in that particular case, they did not want to cover the other vehicles involved because they were not insured primary vehicles. They were only endorsed. And so, luckily, I was able to prove that none of that was explained and properly identified by the agent. And it was also, an odd practice that he committed. And the insurance company actually sent it to underwriting for review, but opted to side with us. So that was a benefit, but it can show you how easily the policy won't cover you, but you think it'll cover you just simply on small words and their definitions.
And I did say that might be the last question, but there is one more that popped in my head. And that is, I have seen where it says medical per person, like $5,000. Is that in addition to or above that 100,000, 300,000 that you were mentioning?
It can be if the value of the case exceeds that $100,000. If it does not exceed the $100,000, for example, then if they issue it, they will just kind of deduct it. They'll consider it together. But if if it's a horrific injury and it's well over 100,000, then they will add it to. The exception being with MedPay. MedPay is different than PIP. MedPay has to be reimbursed despite the circumstances. But PIP is something that's, just for medical payments solely.
And, so this might be the last question, Paul. Stick with me. Thanks for joining me. Umbrella policies. I have heard many agents talk about umbrella policies, adding them on top of your insurance so that if you are in a multi-car collision, there's enough insurance. You want to speak to that for a second?
Yes, absolutely. So umbrella policies are very helpful if you are someone that engages in business regularly, simply because if there is an accident with multiple parties involved and your policy is not sufficient to cover that, then what can happen is that the other parties being represented by attorneys will sue. Okay, and when they sue, although Texas is a home exempt state, they still have access to, if they got a verdict or judgment, and then the liquidation of whatever they can get to try to pay that verdict or judgment. So typically umbrella policies will exist for people who may have assets at any point in time and want to make sure that they personally are not going to be impacted by any accident that occurs. So, anybody that's making serious money, owns real estate, lands, assets, investments, those types of things are all key because those umbrella policies will make sure those are protected.
And I think we'll leave it there for today. Thank you for following my thought process today. This has been very insightful.
No worries. Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate it.
Folks, that's it for today's episode of Advocacy Exchange, Navigating Texas Injury Law. If you've been injured and have questions about how insurance coverage may affect your case, the team at Littleton Law Firm is here to help you and to understand your options. Visit littletonlawfirm.com. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to like, subscribe to the show, and leave us a review. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.